Well, welcome everybody to week 3 in our series where we've been asking this question. Are we really taking responsibility for our own lives? And if you just joining in with us, or maybe you've been with us the whole time and you just forgot what we've learned so far, let me sort of recap what we're learning. First of all, we said that you and I were created to be responsible. We were created for responsibility. In fact, we said that that was one of the first things that God did when He created us. He created human beings and gave them responsibility. And we said that when we're handling our responsibility well, life goes better. You're just happier. In fact, that's what makes your life happy and fulfilled and, you would say, successful. It's when I have been given responsibility and I take that responsibility and I handle that responsibility well. That just makes life better. Things go better. Whether that responsibility is being a mom or a dad or a student or an employer or just being a good friend. When you handle your responsibilities well, we just tend to be happier. Now, on the flip side of that, when we don't handle our responsibility, we said, well, that's when conflict comes into play. We cause conflict not just with other people, we cause conflict within ourselves. In fact, here's what I would guess is most of the guilt that you and I carry around every day comes from the fact that there's a responsibility you didn't feel like you owned up to, or you didn't feel like you handled very well. So that's the conflict within me. And now I feel guilty because of the responsibility that I didn't handle. I would also say that most of the bad blood or the conflict that you feel with other people comes because of an unmet expectation, an unmet responsibility that they feel like you should have done, and you just didn't pull your end of the weight. And so now there's conflict between you and that person. Now, whether that's deserved or whether it's not, it really doesn't matter. Conflict always comes with irresponsibility. And we learned this thing next. We said because your irresponsibility will almost always become someone else's responsibility. See, when I drop the ball, somebody has to come behind me and pick that up. When you don't do your job, somebody has to come behind you and do your job for you. That's why we talked about last week. It's so important that we carry our own weight. Remember the Bible passage we read last week says every person should carry their own load. Whatever responsibility that you've been given, we ought to all learn to carry that and take responsibility for what we've been given. And that led us last week to the big principle that we learned that I have wound up talking to a lot of people about after that message. We said that nobody ever really gets away with anything, that the principle stands. Whatever we sow, that's what we reap. And we said that that's just a principle of life. It's not good, it's not bad, it just is. It's just true. People tend to reap whatever they sow. And we said, that can be on a good side or bad side. You can use that principle to your advantage. You could sow responsibility and reap rewards from that. Or we said you can ignore that principle of life, sow irresponsibility, and see consequences from that. And remember what we said last week, that whenever it comes time for the consequences or the rewards to come back to us, we said we always will reap later and greater. In other words, if I sow irresponsibility and I face consequences in my life, those always probably come later down the road than I would expect, and they last longer than I think that they ought to last, and those consequences are often greater than I think is fair. But on the other side, if we sow responsibly, then rewards come. Now again, they often come later and greater. They come later down the road than I think they ought to come. It takes a little bit longer. I have to be patient. But we also said that if we don't give up, and that was where we ended last week, if you don't give up, if you don't grow weary in doing good, then often the rewards of responsibility will be greater than you would have ever imagined. But the key is you can't give up. Now today, we're going to look at a short story out of the Old Testament, the older part of your Bible. And I just say a lot of you probably don't know this story. Maybe you've never even read it before, or if you have, you just sort of forgot it. It's not one of those popular Bible stories. It's in a book called Joshua. It's in chapter 7. If you want to turn there, open up an app, or maybe just follow along. We'll put the verses on the screen for you. Now, before we read the story, though, I thought it was important just lay it all out there and just sort of tell you what to expect, because here's what I'm pretty sure is going to happen in this story. This story is going to address 3 groups of people, 3 different groups of people, and you'll probably find yourself in one of these groups at some point along the way. But I want to go ahead and just tell you, I think this is going to address 3 groups, and here's the first group. The first group is those of us here today who are religious people, but we have this tendency to want to hide our irresponsibility behind our prayers or some other kind of religious activity. Now, most of you are probably thinking, well, I don't think I do that. Well, truth is you probably have at some point along the way if you're a religious person. It comes like this. You kind of realize that you've done something irresponsible. Somebody calls you out on your irresponsibility. You've got some things that aren't right with you, and so what do you start doing? Well, a lot of us will start praying or working on some other kind of religious drill to try and cover up that. Somebody points out your irresponsibility. I say, hey, this is not right. You say, I know, I need to change that. I know I need to quit that, but I'm working on it. I'm praying about that. And we'll say that. Now, let me just say that for some of you here today, that's why you don't like religious people. In fact, maybe you're thinking, I don't even think I want to be one, because here's the truth. You know some religious people, you know some Christians, and they're the most irresponsible people you know. And at the same time, they act like they're holier than you. They act like they're much better than you are. But at the same time, you watch their life and you know they're not responsible people. But they put on this facade. They put on this face that makes them look like they're responsible or look like they're better than you. And you'll say this. You probably thought this before. You'll think to yourself, man, you are messed up. You need to quit all that religious stuff. You need to quit all that praying you're doing. And you need to get up and do something about that. But the point is, we all fall into this trap. Sometimes it can be easy to hide irresponsibility behind religion or behind prayers. Now, that's the first group. The other group is this. This story is going to address a group of people who, let's just say that sometimes you might have what's called misguided compassion. And here's what I mean by that. You're the kind of person that when somebody you care about, somebody in your family, somebody you love, gets called out on irresponsible behavior, your very first reaction is to want to make excuses for them. You want to feel sorry for them. It goes like this. Somebody say, look at what he's doing. He says, I know, he's doing wrong, and he shouldn't do that, but man, you just need to know he's had a tough childhood. We need to cut him some slack. Or I know she's not where she ought to be, but you need to understand she's not as smart as everybody else, and so it's going to take her a little bit longer. You just need to say, let's just give them a little bit of slack, and you're very compassionate. And I'll just say to you, there's nothing wrong with compassion, and I know it comes from a good place in your heart. I know the intentions are all good, but a lot of times when we do this, we're actually facilitating irresponsibility. Again, nothing wrong with being compassionate, but when we apply it incorrectly, a lot of times we not only don't help the person, we can actually make it worse. So this story is going to talk to those of us who have that tendency. And then here's the third group this story addresses. And I've been waiting to say this for 7 days now, ever since I got done preaching last Sunday. The third group this story addresses is those of you who walked out of this message last week, or you tuned in online and you turned it off, and let's admit it, you were just a little bit ticked off at what I had to say. It's okay. You can admit that. It's all right. I can take it. I mean, I know it happens. But during last week's message, you listened to everything I had to say about the whole sowing and reaping thing, and you heard it, and you thought to yourself, you know what? I get it. I understand the principle. I believe it. People reap what they sow. When we sow a certain way, we get consequences. I get all that, but see, you don't understand my situation. I'm not reaping what I sowed. I'm reaping what somebody else did. The consequences I'm facing in my life, I had nothing to do with. I'm not the one that made the dumb choices. I'm not the one that was irresponsible. It was him. It was her. It was somebody that I care about. And now I'm facing their consequences. Now, can I just say something to those of you who are in that situation? I get it. And you're right. I understand exactly how you might feel that way. If you're in that situation, can I just ask you, just for the next few minutes, set those feelings aside and listen to this story? Because I think what you're about to hear will give you some thoughts on that, and it'll address that whole thought and that whole feeling. And I think that at the end of this might help you with some of those thoughts. So we're going to look at a story out of the Bible. As I said, it's from Joshua chapter 7. And before we read it, I want to give you some context so that you can kind of know where we're at. This is a real important part of this story. Joshua is a military leader. Joshua is the leader of the nation of Israel, and he's the one who's about to lead them in what has become known as the Promised Land. In fact, most of you know this story. Hundreds of years before this, God came to a man named Abraham, and he said, Abraham, I'm going to bless you, and I'm going to create out of your family a nation. It's going to be my nation, the nation of Israel. And he says, when this nation comes to be, he says, when it finally grows, you're going to occupy this land where you're at right now. A lot of people call it the Promised Land or the Holy Land now. And that was the promise that God made to Abraham. Now, we know because we read the story in the Bible that the nation didn't grow to become a nation there in that place. They actually went into Egypt and grew into a nation there. They were enslaved. Many of you know this story. For 400 years, God's people, the nation of Israel, was enslaved by the Egyptians. And then Moses came along. Many of you know that story. Remember the 10 plagues, and he got the people out of slavery, and he led them away from Egypt. And they wandered in the desert for about 40 years. Well, at this point, Joshua is the guy in charge. Moses is gone. Now it's Joshua. He's the one that God is tasked with bringing God's people back into the Promised Land. They're coming home. When they left, the Israelites numbered about 45 people. They're coming home with 2 or 3 million. Now, here's a part of the story that always gives us a lot of trouble because of our modern sensibilities, but let's go ahead and get into it. God tells his people, he says, we're coming home, we're coming back to the Promised Land, and when we get there, there are still some people hanging out in this region, and we're going to completely destroy them. We're going to completely take over. We're going to conquer, we're going to destroy. All these people that are here now are going to get wiped out. We're going to replace the culture. Now, that's hard for us to read, isn't it? Because a lot of us read that and we think, well, that just doesn't sit well with me. In fact, that's what a lot of critics like to do. They like to throw this at the Bible and say, look, God's not loving. There's all that bloodshed. He's condoning violence. And we often wonder, is this still the same God that I read about in the New Testament and the whole deal? Well, here's what I want to do. And I help you kind of understand this just a little bit better. And to do that, I want to take you back to the book of Genesis. There's a verse in the book of Genesis, but I'll warn you before we read it. It's not going to be emotionally satisfying, but it is an explanation for why this is true. Genesis 15. This is the moment when God makes the promise to Abraham about the nation that he's going to create and how they're going to come back to the Promised Land. Here's what God says. Genesis 15. He says, in the 4th generation, your descendants will come back here, the Promised Land. For the sin of the Amorites has not yet reached its full measure. And again, this is not emotionally satisfying, but these cultures that God is talking about who live in this area, they are so wicked that we can almost not even imagine it. The nations God is talking about, the Amorites, they practiced and sanctioned child sacrifice. The abuse of women was not just accepted in their culture, it was sanctioned, it was encouraged, it was built into the way of life. It was just the way life was. There are some stories in the Bible that I could read you that would make you cringe about how awful this was. And God says, I'm going to give them time. In fact, for the past 400 years, God had given them time to change. But he said, when that time comes, God says, because God knows what's going to happen, he said, their sin is going to reach its limit. There's going to be no hope left for them. So God instructs Israel. He says, I want you to come in. I want you to replace the culture. We're going to not intermarry with these people. We're not going to take possessions from them. We're not going to join up with them, make peace. Nothing is going to be left. We're just going to replace the culture. God says, I want you to be an isolated nation. We're going to look at humanity differently. We're going to change society. These cultures are so wicked. They're beyond saving. I want them wiped out. Now, again, that's hard for us to read. And frankly, it's hard to explain what God is doing here. But that's what's going on when we read this story in Joshua. So the nation comes in, and here's the Israelites, and Joshua's leading them. And the first city that they come to is a city called Jericho. Now, Jericho, if you grew up in Sunday school like I did, you may remember the story, maybe even sang a song about how the people marched around the city of Jericho and the walls came tumbling down. God did that on purpose. God made the battle fairly easy for them to take over the city. And there's one reason, and it's the reason that God does things in your life. He wants them to trust him. See, God doesn't want his nation to trust their military might. He doesn't want them to trust their smarts or their resources. God says, I want you to trust me. And so God helps them. He comes in and he makes the battle fairly easy. And so they come in and they take over. And now they're coming to the second battle. And this is a little town called Ai. Now, they're getting ready to conquer this town called Ai. And when we read the story, there's one thing that Joshua doesn't know, but as the reader of this story, we read before this. During the conquering of Jericho, something happens. There's a guy named Achan. And Achan's just a dude. He's helping the army, and he's walking through. And as they're conquering Jericho, he sees all the destruction around him, and he looks down at some point, and he sees there's some valuable stuff here. He sees gold. He sees silver. And he thinks to himself, why aren't we taking that? I mean, why would we just leave that there? Why would we destroy it? I mean, we could use this stuff. And so when nobody's looking, Achan reaches down, and he takes some gold, takes some silver, puts it in his pocket, heads back to his tent, and he hides it in his tent, completely disobeying what God had asked them to do. That's where we pick up the story in Joshua chapter 7, verse 2. It says, Now Joshua sent men from Jericho to Ai, which is near Beth-aven, to the east of Bethel, and he told them, Go up and spy out the region. So the men went up and spied out Ai. When they returned to Joshua, they said, Not all the army will have to go up against Ai. Send 2,000 or 3,000 men to take it, and don't weary the whole army, for only a few people live there. So these spies come back and they say, Look, this town's not even half the size of Jericho. There's no reason we should get the whole army involved. There's no reason to suit them all up. Just send about 2,000 or 3,000 guys down there. We'll take care of it, no problem. So about 3,000 went up. They were routed by the men of Ai, who killed about 36 of them. They chased the Israelites from the city gate as far as the stone quarries and struck them down on the slopes. At this, the hearts of the people melted in fear and became like water. Because, I mean, the Israelites are shocked at what just happened. I mean, just think about it. It's almost like an NFL football team going up against a little high school team, and the high school team whips them. I mean, this was not expected. There's no way they could have anticipated this. So now they're scared. They're freaking out. They're not sure exactly what's going on. Verse 6. Then Joshua tore his clothes. He fell face down to the ground before the ark of the Lord, remaining there till evening. The elders of Israel did the same. They sprinkled dust on their heads. Now that doesn't make sense to us, this whole tearing the clothes and sprinkling dust, but in their culture it was a huge thing. This is a sign of deep sorrow. It's a sign of mourning for them. Basically what they're saying is, God, what are you doing? Why is this happening to us? You gave us this huge victory in Jericho. It went so well. You promised you'd bring us into this land, and now you've let this tiny little nothing town defeat us. God, why is this happening to us? Now, incidentally, isn't that what you and I say when things don't go our way? We just want to know, why is this happening to me? That's what they're doing. Verse 7. And Joshua said, Alas, sovereign Lord, why did you ever bring this people across the Jordan to deliver us into the hands of the Amorites, to destroy us? Notice the language here. Joshua's saying, God, I mean, you did this. I mean, if you'd have just left us alone, if you'd have left us way back in Egypt, we wouldn't be experiencing this. None of this would have ever happened. I mean, God, what are you thinking? And then notice he gets bolder here. Look at what Joshua says. He says, Pardon your servant, Lord. He's like, I don't mean to offend you, God, but I think I'm about to. What can I say now that Israel's been routed by its enemies? The Canaanites, the other people of the country, they're going to hear about this. They're going to surround us and wipe out our name from the earth. What then will you do for your own great name? He's like, God, aren't you embarrassed by what just happened? Don't you know what's about to happen now? I mean, as if God doesn't know what's going to happen next. I mean, it's just funny how we talk to God when we're in those situations. He says, God, don't you remember what your plan was? You were going to use us. You were going to use this nation to show everybody around how great you are and that you're the one true God. And now look what you've gone and done. It's like he's talking to a kid. How are we ever going to convince them that you're a great God now? God, your plan is not working. What are you going to do about it? And God answers him. And I love God's answer. Look at verse 10. The Lord said to Joshua, Stand up. What are you doing down on your face? Notice what God says. He says, Joshua, get up. I mean, why are you on your knees? Why are you praying? Joshua, this is not a time to pray. There's no praying here. Get up. It's time to take action. And look at what God says. It's so huge. God says, Israel has sinned. They have violated my covenant, which I commanded them to keep. They have taken some of the devoted things. They have stolen. They have lied. They have put them with their own possessions, to which those of us who are reading the story and we know what happened, we're thinking, no, wait, God, you've got it all wrong. Maybe you didn't read the story, or maybe you just weren't paying attention. But there's no they here. I mean, it's not a they, it's a he. And in fact, it's a guy. His name is Achan. We know. We read the story. He's the one that took the gold. He's the one that disobeyed you. He's the one that lied. Why are you saying the whole nation? Why is it a they, God? It's not a they. It's a he. And God says, no, it's not. Because that is the nature of irresponsibility. Notice what God says next. He says, this is why the Israelites can't stand against their enemies. They turn their backs and they run, because they have been made liable to destruction. I will not be with you anymore unless you destroy whatever among you is devoted to destruction. So go, consecrate the people. Tell them, consecrate yourselves in preparation for tomorrow. For this is what the Lord, the God of Israel, says. There are devoted things among you, Israel, and you cannot stand against your enemies until you remove them. Now this is where all of this story applies to where we are at today. See, this is what happens in a community when irresponsibility takes hold. When someone acts irresponsibility, this is what happens to community. Yes, it was one guy who disobeyed, but the consequences of what the one guy did affected the entire community. But that's not fair. You're right, it's not fair. But that is the nature of being in community. That's the nature of being a part of a relationship. That's the nature of being in a family. Not only do people reap what they sow, but everybody who's connected to them reaps too. And it's not fair, and it's not right, but it's true. See, it's not fair that you've been a good wife the whole marriage. It's not fair that you've been faithful to your husband. It's not fair that you've done right by your kids, and now the choices of your husband are costing you and them. It's not fair for a kid to have to suffer sometimes lifelong consequences over a stupid choice that mom or dad or another family member made. It's not fair that one employer can make one decision that affects your job security or your workplace environment, but it does not change the reality. Whatever you sow, if I'm connected to you, I will also reap. See, this is why we cannot afford to tolerate irresponsibility in the people who are connected to us. Because eventually, everybody connected to that person, they're going to pay. And listen, I know none of us like confrontation. Nobody likes to confront other people. But sometimes the best thing you can do for your family or your community or your network of friends when you see irresponsibility is you got to confront it. That's why when you act irresponsibly, you can't just say, oh, it's nobody's business. It's all on me. You can't say that. Because if you're connected to me, it is my business. Because what you sow, if I'm connected to you, I'm liable to reap as well. Remember what we said. Your irresponsibility, my irresponsibility, eventually will become someone else's responsibility. And that someone, unfortunately, will most likely be the person who's close to you. It'll most likely be the people you love most. So listen, if you've been tempted to have a little bit of a misplaced compassion for somebody in your life, someone you tended to make excuses for, you got to stop. It's time. Ignoring their irresponsibility will eventually blow back on you and people that you care about. You're not doing them a favor. You're not doing yourself any favors by making excuses. In fact, go back and read the rest of Joshua's story. I mean, the way the story ends is God says, Joshua, it's time to quit praying. You got to get up off your knees, and so he does. He quits praying. He realizes this is no time to pray. It's time to act. They go out, they search the camp, and sure enough, just as God told them, they go to Achan's tent, they find the silver, they find the gold. Achan's punished. He's dealt with by the whole community. The Israelites then go back, they attack Ai, and this time God's power's with them, and they take the city. But here's the question for all of us, especially those of us religious people. Are we hiding irresponsibility behind our prayers? Is there something that you're praying about right now and it's time to stop praying and it's time to take action? Now you may be thinking, well, how do I know that? Well, I'll tell you one way. I'll tell you one way you know you need to stop praying. If God has already addressed something in His Word, if God has already addressed it, then you can stop praying about it. Because the answer is not going to change. God's already given you the answer. Like, if you're wondering whether or not you should tell the truth, if you're wondering whether you should pay your taxes or not, if you're wondering about being faithful to somebody, if you're wondering about having sex outside of your marriage, if you're wondering about forgiving another person, good news. You can get off your knees today and you can stop praying. God has already addressed those issues in His Word. It's in black and white. But I talk to so many people and they talk to me about issues and they go, I'm just struggling with this. I don't know what to do. I'm just going to go home and I'm going to pray about it for a few weeks or a few months. Listen, if God's already addressed it in His Word, don't pray about it. Because there's no amount of prayer that's going to change God's answer. He's already given it to you. I'll tell you another way you can know that you're hiding behind your prayers. If you find that you're trying to pray your way out of a situation you behaved your way into, it's time to stop praying and it's time to start acting. See, listen, if your actions and your decisions got you into the situation that you're in today, guess what's probably going to get you out? Your actions and your decisions. Now, listen, should you pray while you're working your way out of it? Absolutely. In fact, you ought to pray. You ought to pray for God's help and God's power to help you through it. But if you are substituting prayer for taking action or taking responsibility, guess what you've become? You have become an irresponsible person who prays. That's all. You're an irresponsible person who prays. And God is saying to you today, get off your knees. It's time to stop praying. It's time to do something. Listen, don't just pray that God will help you meet the right person. You need to stop hanging out where the wrong people are and start hanging out where the right people are. Don't just pray that God will give you a healthy relationship. Start doing healthy things. Don't pray for better finances. Work hard. Save. Pay off your debts. Downsize if you have to. Don't just pray for your kids. Engage your kids. Spend time with your kids. And for all of our sakes, please discipline your kids. Don't just pray to get a good grade. Study. Do your homework. Follow the instructions. Don't pray for good health. Eat right. Exercise. Don't just pray for your neighbors. Serve them. Do you see where I'm going with this? You tracking? Think about it this way. I'll bet there are prayers that you pray on a regular basis that if the people who know you best were to hear you pray those prayers, their first thought would be, well, that's good that you're praying for that, but I don't really think you're doing very much about it. In fact, here's my challenge. I'll bet this will change your prayers. The next time you pray for something, imagine that your wife's listening. Imagine that your husband's listening. Imagine that your parents are listening. Imagine that your best friend is listening to you pray that prayer, and think to yourself, what would they say? How would they react to the fact that I am praying about this right now? My guess is you'll learn a lot about whether or not you're taking responsibility for your life. So, let's talk about what we're going to do. What do we need to do to take next steps? In fact, I want you to go ahead and grab your connection card that's on your seat or somewhere nearby, and I want you to look at the back of it. If you're new here today, this is just a part of the service where we try to take what we learn and actually do something with it, put it into action. And we do that by checking a box and making a commitment that we'll do something this week with what we learned. Not because checking a box changes anything, but sometimes we just need a reminder, a moment where we can say, God, I'm going to do this. And most importantly, if you'll allow us to know about it, if you'll turn this card in, we'll pray for you. We pray for every single person that these cards represent. Today, maybe just listening to me, you realize that in some way you've been hiding irresponsibility behind some religious activity. Maybe you've been praying about something a long time, and your irresponsibility is costing someone either right now or it's going to cost them somewhere down the road. And it's going to be somebody you care about. Trust me, somebody you love, they're going to pay. Could be the person sitting right next to you right now. And this week, This could be your time where you just say, I'm going to get up off my knees. I'm going to stop praying about it because it's time to stop praying and it's time to take action. I behaved my way into this. I'm going to behave my way out. If you'll just check that box and say, you know what, this week I'm going to get up. I'm going to take action. We'll pray for you. Or maybe for others of you, the question is this. Are there some irresponsible people in your life, and they're maybe directly or indirectly affecting your life? And the truth is, you're just afraid to do anything about it. You don't want to cause ripples. I get that. I know you're a compassionate person. You don't want it to come across as you being prideful or better than them. I get all that. But listen, ignoring that, making excuses for them, picking up the slack for them, that is a lose-lose scenario every single time. You're losing, they're losing. And truth be told, somebody you love is probably losing too. But listen, as Christ followers, the two highest values in our lives are love God and love people. And I know we don't like to say it this way, but loving someone enough to allow them not to be irresponsible, that's what love does. That's what love is. So maybe today your next step is, I'm just going to have a conversation. And listen, this is not a conversation about spewing your anger. That's not what this is. In fact, if you can't do it without spewing anger, then don't do it. This is not about shaming anybody into anything. If you can't do it without shaming, don't do it. This is not about pointing fingers and putting blame on somebody. This is about you saying to a person you care about, let me help you. What can I do to help you stand up on your own 2 feet and begin to take responsibility for your life? I'm here for you. Let me love you enough to pull you out of your irresponsibility. Maybe it's time for you to have that conversation, and if you'll allow us to, we'll pray for you as you do that this week. Whatever step you take, I pray you'll make it. Let's bow and pray. God, thank you for your example that you've left us in your word. And God, as hard as it is for us to hear sometimes, a lot of times there's irresponsibility around us that we don't control, and it affects all of us. It's the nature of being in community. God, may we not hide behind religious activity. May we not hide behind our prayers. And God, may we not just continue to cut each other the slack that we think is loving when it truly is not. God, may we be the kind of people that get up off of our knees when it's time and take action. And that we would lovingly confront one another and help each other stand against the irresponsibility that exists in all of our lives. Pray this in Jesus' name. Amen.